Analog photography is a ton of fun, super rewarding, and it's probably the best way to make your photography experience more tangible. But it's really easy to make mistakes in the beginning as well because you don't have that instant feedback that you get when you're shooting on a digital camera. You can make a mistake and not find out about it until weeks later, potentially, when you get your scans back from the lab. So in order to help you not do the same things that I did and waste frames and shoot blank rolls, here are the mistakes that I have made in my journey through shooting 35mm film. Now, earlier when I was shooting a bunch of disposable cameras, which I don't really recommend, if you're shooting disposable cameras, please check out this video, link down in the description, about the Mew. Amazing camera. But when I was shooting disposable cameras early on, I thought, you know, I'm just gonna take it to the CVS up the street from my house and they'll do a perfectly fine job, right? The chemistry is the same no matter where you send it. And while the chemistry is indeed the same, or it should be, most labs should be doing it the same way, you'll find that you get varied results depending on what lab you use. And that's because there's a whole process involved called the scanning of your negatives. When people scan your negatives, the technician actually goes through and makes individual adjustments to make sure that the density, the overall contrast, the color balance, make sure that those things are looking good. And something that you don't get at a drugstore is you don't get someone who's actually making sure that your stuff is coming out properly, making sure that it's in the proper orientation. They're just running it through a machine, sending it back to you digitally, and they don't actually include your negatives. I have a whole bunch of really sentimental, wonderful photos that I took on disposable cameras that I had developed at a CVS, and all I have are the really low resolution scans that I got back from that crappy CD that they give you. So there's really no way for me to go back and rescan those images and get a better quality image out of them. They are unfortunately kind of lost. So yeah, don't do that. Use an actual professional film lab. The one I use is State Film Lab in Louisville, Kentucky. They do an amazing job. You just mail your stuff to them and they will send you back your negatives and they will upload your images to Dropbox. There's really nothing quite like the feeling of getting your scans back from the lab with this just like, feels like Christmas. You're opening your folder of scans and inside it's just black images because you didn't wind the film properly and you ended up exposing the same frame all of those times. Now, the thing that's tricky about winding your film properly is, you know, you can follow the directions. You can put it on the spool and you can, you know, okay, you can wind up and the counter will still be going up and you'll still be shooting, right? But the indicator that shows you that your film is being wound isn't moving. So you want to make sure that when you wind your film on, you get it nice and tight, do a couple of test cranks, check the film take-up indicator or whatever they call this thing, make sure it's spinning, because if it's not, your film's not moving. Now on this camera, actually what happened was I thought that I was winding it improperly. I'd follow the directions, I'd put it in really precisely, I'd do everything that I could. I even went through the effort of taping the film to this side to make sure that it would stay and keep moving and not accidentally come off. But it turns out that this camera actually has a broken clutch. Thanks for a good prop, but this camera actually has a broken clutch. So if you are having difficulties with your camera not taking up the film and you've tried everything, you might need to actually get it checked out by a professional repair shop. When you start shooting film, it might seem like it's hard to mess up. It's just, but you point at things and it just looks great. But it's actually a little bit more finicky than you might think. You really have to get your exposure right. And the best way to do that is to make sure that you're metering properly. And to meter properly, we need to know what metering is. Essentially, metering is taking an exposure reading of something. And that reading will tell you what settings you need to use to get that thing you metered for to middle gray. Now, middle gray is basically just midtones. It's just gray. It looks like this. Super exciting, right? Now, how we meter properly is, what do we meter for? So, you don't want to have your sky be as bright as middle gray. Last time I went outside and I looked up, yeah, that's brighter than middle gray. So you want to make sure that you're not exposing your highlights for middle gray unless you're doing so for some reason. I don't know. Usually, in most cases, especially with color negative film, you probably want to be exposing for the shadows, which means that you take an exposure reading for the shadows. Now, this can be a little bit backwards for someone who's used to a conventional digital workflow, because it's kind of the opposite. Shooting digital, you kind of want to underexpose your images because it doesn't handle overexposure really well. In color negative film's case, you want to overexpose because it really craves the light. It's better to overexpose than to underexpose, because if you underexpose, then your underexposed areas aren't going to get enough light. There's not going to be any detail there. They're going to start to look muddy, and you might get this weird looking color cast that you really can't save an underexposed image. Now, if you were shooting slide film, I don't think that many beginners are shooting much slide film, but if you're shooting slide film, you want to be particular about where your highlights are and where your shadows are, because there's a much smaller room for error. It doesn't have the dynamic range that color negative film does. So you want to make sure that your highlights and your shadows aren't too far apart and that neither is going too far in either direction. It's not super great for high contrast scenes, as you can see in some of these images. Now, if you're using a point and shoot camera, you really don't have many manual exposure controls, if any. So the best thing that you can do is, when you're half pressing for autofocus, try and get that autofocus point somewhere in the shadows, because odds are your autofocus point is also going to be where your camera is metering. If you're trying to get some of those really juicy long exposure bangers and your images aren't coming out bright enough, it's probably because you're not factoring for reciprocity failure. Reciprocity failure is the term that describes the phenomenon of film being less sensitive to light the longer it is exposed. It's something that we need to be aware of anytime we're shooting exposures for longer than a second. So for example, if you take an exposure reading of this and it says you need a 10-second exposure, when you factor in reciprocity, it's actually going to be this. Now, how do you factor in reciprocity? Well, each film stock has a different reciprocity failure chart. So it can get kind of confusing when you're, oh, I'm shooting a new film. Oh, it's nighttime. Oh, I need to find a reciprocity failure thing so I can figure out how to expose this film. Just save yourself a lot of time and just get yourself an app. This is the one I use. I don't know what it's called. I think it's just called Reciprocity Timer or something like that. Works good. Has film. Enter time. Give you time. Do the thing. This is one that I probably should be embarrassed to admit, but I mean, we all gotta learn our mistakes somehow, I guess. So basically, as the story goes, I was shooting a roll of Fuji C200 at my mom's house, just documenting some everyday things, and it was getting dark, and I was like, I'm gonna go into my room and photograph my room at night on film. Never done that before. Should look cool. No, it didn't look cool. It looked hot. It looked orange. It was the opposite of cool. It did not look cool at all. So I obviously realized my problem after I got my scans back, and that was that, oh, I was shooting the wrong white balance film in the wrong white balance environment. So if you want to shoot photos in artificial light, tungsten environments, you should probably use something like Cinestill 800T or a different tungsten balance film. So those are the top 5 mistakes that I made when getting into shooting more film. I hope that it saves you some headaches and frustration and saves some of your photos in the future. And don't be discouraged if you are still making mistakes and your photos aren't coming out the way that you want. It's a really rewarding medium, and I hope that it brings you as much joy as it does me. So thanks for watching. Take care.